Thanks so much for being with us today. I hope you'll take out your message outline, and as you do that, let me ask you this question. Who doesn't love a good story? Well, here's the answer to that question. First, fill in the blank on your outline. We all love a good story. But what's not apparent to us is that each one of us is creating a story. It's actually the story of our lives. When someone asks us about our past, where we're from, how we met our spouse, what school we went to, we dip into a chapter, if you would, of our story, of our life. But we don't often think of our lives as a story. We think of something that happened as a moment in the past. But every event or every season of our life, once it's behind us, we reclassify it as a story. And our hope is this. We hope it's not a story that's too painful or too embarrassing to tell. The determining factor, whether we want to tell that story or not, is the decisions that we make while our story is unfolding. The truth is this. Look at this fill-in. We write the story of our lives, and we write that story one decision at a time. We're on a message series entitled Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. If you haven't been with us the last couple of weeks, let me just share with you some highlights from our previous messages. These are going to be on the screen. They will not be on your outline. The big point in this whole series is this. We often overlook the relationship between good questions and good decisions. Here's what good questions do for us. Good questions set us up for good decisions. And in this series, I've made you a promise. The promise is this. If you will ask, honestly answer, and act on the 5 questions in this series that we're looking at, you are going to make better decisions and you're going to have fewer regrets. Perhaps more important or most important is this. Not only will your life be better, but the people who look to you, depend on you, need you, they're going to be better off as well. Because we aren't the only ones impacted by our decisions and our regrets. During this message series, I've also asked you to memorize one verse of Scripture, one sentence. It's found in Proverbs chapter 27, verse 12. This is on your message outline. I hope you've taken the time to learn it. The verse simply tells us that the prudent or the wise person, when they see danger, what do? They take refuge. They make the appropriate decision. On the other hand, the simple person, one who's naive, one who doesn't ask questions, just kind of believes what they've been told, one who doesn't connect the dots, understanding that our decisions today impact our future tomorrow. The simple person, they just keep going and they pay the penalty. They suffer the consequences of their decision. Last week, again, this is some information that is on the screen but not on your outline. The 5 questions that we're looking at bring us into conflict with the sales associate that lives inside of our head. And yes, every one of us has such a sales associate. The voice in our head wants us to act now, decide fast. They want us to focus on the immediate rather than the ultimate. But the 5 questions that we're looking at, if we will use them in our lives, they will slow us down and they will help us create the perspective that we need in order to see danger coming. This brought us to the very first question we looked at last week. It's the integrity question. And it simply goes like this. Am I being honest with myself? Am I being honest with myself? And we said because sometimes we're deceitful even of ourselves, we need to ask the question 2 times and add a second word. Am I being honest with myself really? And I hope this past week that maybe you have been more honest with yourself, even if it brings a little pain into your life. We said last week that acknowledging where we are is the first step to moving toward where we ultimately want to be. So when making a decision of any magnitude, we need to ask ourselves the question, am I being honest with myself? That brings us to the second question that we want to look at today. We're going to refer to it as the legacy question, and it's simply this. What story do I want to tell? Or what story do I want to be told if someone else is telling the story I was involved in? In other words, when the business deal is done, when the relationship situation is over, when the season of your life now is past and it's now just a story, what story do you want to be told? Do you want to be a hero in your stories, or do you want to be a villain? Do you want to be a role model, or do you want to be a bad example? Which option in this story is worth remembering? Our hope is this, that it wouldn't be a story that we hope no one ever knows or finds out about. So which option would make you proud to tell your children, proud to tell your grandkids? And again, the good news is this, we decide what story because we're the ones who write our stories. We need to realize that every decision that you make, every decision I make, brings a permanent or becomes a permanent part of our story, whether that's a good story or a bad story. Let me give you some examples. Here's one. Your boss asks you to lie to a client. You're not a liar, but you lied anyway. The client called you on it. Your boss threw you under the bus. You lost your job. Not a good story, is it? Compare it to this one. Your boss asks you to lie, and you choose not to lie. You lose your job because you wouldn't do what your boss asked you to do. Not exactly the outcome we want, but isn't that a better story? Here's another example. You meet this guy. He was kind of okay. He was convenient. There wasn't anybody else on the horizon. But something in you knew this really wasn't something you should pursue. But you did it anyway. And now 2 years later, the whole thing has just evaporated. And you hope no one ever asks you about it. And then here's a final example. Your friends wanted you to go out, but you had an exam to study for. And so you said no. They pressed you. But you stayed in and you studied and you aced that exam. That was a decision you made over and over. And now you have a degree and a great job to show for it. The point I want you to understand is this, that every decision and the outcome of that decision becomes part of your story, which means decision by decision, you and I are writing the story of our lives. So when making decisions of any consequence, we need to pause. We need to look ahead. We need to ask, when this is nothing more than a story that I tell, what story do I want to tell? Look at this fill in. But here's a challenge for us. Most of us don't think this way. We don't see our lives as a story. How would you like this story? I lost my job. I was embarrassed. I told friends I was doing consulting work. But I wasn't consulting. I was consoling myself every afternoon with a bottle. I racked up a ton of debt. I lost the respect of my wife and kids. And even worse, I lost my self-respect. Look at this fill in. You and I would like to be able to tell our entire story without skipping any parts or chapters or having to lie about the details. You want to be the hero in your story. Isn't that what we all want? And the answer, I think, would certainly be yes. So you and I need to decide a good story, to write a good story, and we do that by the decisions that we make. Now, one reason that we don't think about story when making decisions is because we get distracted by the pressure and especially the emotions of the moment. Emotions are now, right? We think about later when? Later when it's usually too late to do anything about it. Our emotions create almost like a dense fog for us. It's so hard to clearly see through it. Our emotions complicate the decision-making process by focusing our attention on the immediate rather than the ultimate. And we're left in terms of thinking, what are our options versus what about our story? We think of the immediate, not the ultimate outcomes. And the reason so often that you and I have regrets when we look back on our lives and we say, what was I thinking? It's usually because we were pressured with something that had a very, very strong emotional appeal to us. Psychologists have a name for this phenomena. But once our appetites are engaged in the decision-making process, to some degree, we kind of lose our minds. Psychologists call this focalism. Focalism. It's the idea that victims hyper-focus on the one thing to the neglect of pretty much everything else. If you've ever been in love, chances are focalism has happened to you. It's the idea that when we're in love, isn't it so that all we could see was him. All we could think about was her. And everything else kind of just faded into the background. And it blurred out other things that were important. You and I were so in love, we just couldn't see her credit card debt. We were so in love, you couldn't see his dating history. If you had been thinking clearly, probably you and I, maybe we would have run for the hills instead of pursued that relationship. But at the time, we were so into it. It was all so wonderful, so it seemed. When you and I are confronted with anything or any strong emotional appeal, we need to press the pause button in our life, not the play button. Because strong emotional appeal should trigger a red light for us, not a green light. Instead of leaning into the situation, we should take a step back. And not because she's not the right one. Maybe she is. Not because that's not a good investment. Maybe it is. Not because that isn't the perfect job. Maybe it is. But we step back because anything with a strong emotional appeal will cloud our judgment. So we pause, we get our bearings right, we think about it, we call a friend, we consider our future story. And when you consider your story, here's what it does. It places the decision-making process within the border, or the broader context of our entire lives. Our stories are all future tense. So every decision should be made with this question in mind. What story do I want to tell? Now, we're not the first generation to face this type of situation and to deal with this. Many of you are familiar with the story of Joseph found in the Old Testament portion of the Bible. Today, we're going to look at a condensed version of Joseph's story. His story is a great reminder of how powerful and legacy-preserving this question is. What story do I want to tell? We know that Joseph's story begins around 1800 BC. We pick up Joseph's story. We're told in Scripture he is 17 years old. He is 11th of 12 boys in the family. He is his father's favorite son, primarily because his father Jacob had several wives. Joseph's mom was his favorite wife, and Joseph was born later on, the 11th of the 12 boys. We find that Joseph's story is in Genesis chapter 37 through verse 50. If you haven't read this story, it's been a long time, I want to encourage you, go back and read this story. There's so much we won't be able to cover. We're just going to be able to hit the high points. But we know that his brothers were jealous of Joseph, and that Joseph's dad had given him, remember, that special coat, that coat of many colors. If you've ever seen the Broadway musical, Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, it tells the story of Joseph. If you ever get a chance and you haven't seen the musical, it's incredibly good. I would encourage you to go and see it. But Joseph's brothers are taking care of their livestock. That was the wealth that was in their family, was invested in livestock. They're out taking care of their family's herds. And they see Joseph coming in the distance to check up on his brothers. They decide to kill Joseph. But we see as the story goes on that they actually don't take Joseph's life. They wind up selling him into slavery, which was a better decision. They got some money from that. But now they have to tell their dad some story, what became of Joseph. And in Genesis chapter 37, in verse 31 and 32, here's what they did. Then they got Joseph's robe. They slaughtered a goat, and they dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this, examine this to see whether it is your son's robe." Now, I want you to clearly understand what the brothers are doing at this point in their life. 10 brothers now have a secret that they're going to be forced to live with for the rest of their life. It's not a story they would want to tell. It's a story they could not tell. If they told the story, it would probably go something like this. We were jealous of our younger brother, so 10 of us beat him up and we sold him as a slave. And then we lied to our father and said he was killed by some wild animal, and we watch it break our father's heart. That's a story nobody would want to tell. So they have to hide this secret. If you get nothing else out of this message today, please take this away with you. Please don't decide anything that will make you a liar for life. Whatever you may gain in that moment will not be worth what you're forced to live with, what you're forced to carry around with you for the rest of your life, which is a story you would hope and you pray that no one ever finds out. Joseph is taken to Egypt, where he is sold again as a slave for a second time to a man named Potiphar, who was the captain of Pharaoh's palace guard, a man of some importance because of his position in the Egyptian government, if you would. Joseph now as a slave has a decision to make. What does he do? Does he try to run away and maybe find his way back to his home? Does he do as little as he can, was probably the mindset of most of the slaves? Or does Joseph decide to throw himself full hard into this position he finds himself? And that's exactly what he decided to do, to give it his all. Joseph came from a very wealthy family. They had slaves in his family. He knew the life, the routine of a slave. But I want you to realize as we go through Joseph's story, none of what happened was Joseph's fault. Someone else took control of Joseph's story. And when someone else takes control or decides our story, it is so easy to give up and simply kind of roll with fate, whatever it may be. But Joseph deserves to serve Potiphar's household as if it's his own family. And Potiphar quickly notices Joseph's work ethic. We're told this in Genesis 39:6. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, folks, that's a story worth telling. Maybe it goes something like this. I was kidnapped and sold into slavery. I was a victim, but I decided not to live like a victim. I decided to trust God and to do the best I could with what I had. Eventually, we see in Potiphar's household, Joseph finds himself in a no-win situation, again through no fault of his own. Joseph now is probably 19 or 20 years old. He has no prospect of ever seeing his family or his homeland again. In Genesis 39:6-7, we find this. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. Come and sleep with me, she demanded. I want you to understand that this is first and foremost not just a moral issue, not just primarily deciding something right or wrong. In dealing with Potiphar's wife, look at this fill-in. In dealing with Potiphar's wife, Joseph has two options, neither of which would lead to a good outcome. This literally for Joseph was a life and death issue. It was more accurately probably more like a death and death issue because either choice he would make, he could lose his life. Joseph is a slave with absolutely no rights. He could not refuse anything, including the right to tell his master's wife no. But he also knew that betraying Potiphar and how well Potiphar had treated him would not be right. So Joseph opts for the better story. We can only imagine maybe a conversation he had with Mrs. Potiphar. Maybe it went something like this. Mrs. Potiphar, I came to this land as a slave. I had no rights and no future. Your husband purchased me. He treated me with kindness. I did my best to serve him and his family as if it were my own. I've worked hard. I've done everything required of me. With my God's help, I've worked my way to the point where your husband trusts me with everything. He's put me in charge of his entire household. Now, maybe that's what he said, but we know he did say this. In Genesis 39, verse 8 and 9, he says this to Potiphar's wife. With me in charge, he told Mrs. Potiphar, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, Mrs. Potiphar, because you are his wife. And here he's implying that Mrs. Potiphar, now this is your story. What story do you want to tell? You need to think this through. Do you really want to have an affair with a Hebrew slave as part of your story? And then he speaks to the bigger picture. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against my God? Two options Joseph has. Again, this is on the screen, not on your outline. Here are the two options. The first one is this. Joseph could say, your husband gave me an opportunity I never dreamed would come my way. I was faithful to him and to God who's been watching over and looking out for me. That's a good story. Here's the second option. Your husband gave me an opportunity I never dreamed would come my way. So I took advantage of his trust and I had an affair with his wife. Which story would you want to tell? We see this. Joseph did the right thing. Joseph did the right thing, but notice this, but the right thing did not turn out for Joseph. In Genesis 39:10, we find this happening. And though Mrs. Potiphar spoke to Joseph day after day. He refused to go to bed or even to be with her. Now, this was very humiliating for Potiphar's wife, so eventually she accuses Joseph of trying to rape her. Joseph ends up in Pharaoh's dungeon. The fact, though, that Potiphar did not have Joseph killed, because if it had really been true he had tried to rape his wife, he probably would have, it implies that he didn't believe his wife's story of Joseph trying to rape her. But Joseph winds up in a prison where political prisoners are kept. This is not looking like a great ending to Joseph's story. But in Genesis 39:21, here's what we find. But the Lord was where? The Lord, we're told, was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. And if that's true, and it was, it does raise some pretty interesting questions, isn't it? We may think this: if God was with him, why didn't God keep all this from happening to Joseph? If God was with Joseph, why isn't he back at home with his family and his murderous brothers? Why weren't they serving time in Egypt? If God was really with Joseph, why wasn't Potiphar's scheming, no good wife tossed out into the street and Joseph was honored for his integrity? Isn't it true good things are supposed to happen to good people? But everything in this story seems wrong. But Joseph's story is not over. And for some of you, maybe this is the reason God has you watching this message right now. He wants you to hear this. Regardless of what you're going through right now, your story isn't over either. Your story is being written, is still being written. How's it being written? One decision at a time. And our responses are what make all the difference. Now, many of you know, look at this fill in the blank. Many of you know how Joseph's story turns out. But here's what I want you to understand. Joseph didn't know. Joseph had no idea. What all Joseph could see was he would spend the rest of his life in prison for something he did not even do. But just as with Potiphar, Joseph begins to serve the prison warden, and he wins his favor. And after a time, Joseph is pretty much running the prison. But 8 years go by. 8 long years. Joseph is being punished for something he never even did. 2 employees are now thrown into the prison who had served Pharaoh. They both had dreams. They share those dreams with Joseph, and Joseph tells them that the interpretation of dreams belongs to God. But as he heard their dreams, God gave him the interpretation. And the dream simply meant that one of the prisoners who had served Pharaoh would be released. The other would be returned. The one would be returned to his job, released and returned to his job. The other would be executed. It happened just as Joseph said. The one who was released and returned back to his job was the cupbearer. Now, that's not a term that we use today. What does a cupbearer do? It was a very influential, very important job. In those days, one of the easiest ways to kill the ruling authority was to poison them. So the cupbearer would drink any wine that the Pharaoh was about to drink. He would eat some of the food Pharaoh was about to eat, so to make sure it wasn't poison. If it didn't kill the cupbearer, then the Pharaoh or the official would eat that. It was a very lucrative, very lush job, some great meals. But if you ever got a little poison, it would really be a killer, wouldn't it? We find this happening in Genesis chapter 40, verse 14 and 15. Once the cupbearer is released, probably the last thing, Joseph grabbed him and he was going out the door, and he said this to him: "And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well from you, and when you're back in Pharaoh's good graces, mention me to Pharaoh so that he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did absolutely nothing to deserve it." But I want you to notice how Joseph responded to all this. Joseph was making the best decisions possible under the circumstances. But check it out. He was neither happy nor content with the circumstances he found himself in. My guess is once the cupbearer left the prison, Joseph packed his bags. He had them ready to go, knowing any moment he was going to be released from prison. But we're told in Genesis 40, verse 23 this: Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. 2 more years passed. 2 more long years. When it feels like nothing we do matters, it is difficult, it is very difficult to be concerned with what we do. When we couldn't care less because it seems nobody else cares, that's when we get careless and we make bad decisions. We create regret. regret never creates a good story. 2 years later, we're told Pharaoh has a disturbing dream. His advisors, his magicians, cannot interpret it. And guess who the cupbearer finally remembered? Oh, Pharaoh. Don't want to talk a lot about it, but if you remember that time you were kind of on outs with me and I got put in prison, there was a Hebrew slave there who could tell stories, who could interpret dreams. Maybe he could help you. And Joseph is quickly sent for. He is bathed, he is reclothed, he is shaved, he's brought before Pharaoh. And Joseph says to Pharaoh that God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. And when he says God, he's referring to his God, the God of the Hebrews, not one of the many gods of the Egyptians, but the one true God. And Pharaoh shares his dream with Joseph. God gives Joseph the interpretation. It went simply like this. For the next 7 years, you're going to have plentiful crops of grain, bumper crops bigger than you've ever seen before. But after those 7 good years, you're going to have 7 years of famine, incredible famine like you've never seen before. And it's like most of those civilizations in that time, in that day, grain was necessary because bread was pretty much their staple food of their diets rather. And if you didn't have any grain, you had no bread. The people would starve. And so Joseph, after he interprets the dream, he does something unheard of. As soon as these words came out of Joseph's mouth, those listening to this went, "Oh, no, don't do that. That's going to cost you your life." Joseph gave Pharaoh some unsolicited advice. You didn't do that with Pharaoh. Joseph did. And here's what he said to Pharaoh. He says, "You need to find someone, Pharaoh, to oversee the grain storage for the next 7 years to prepare for the famine that is coming." All the others who heard this thought, "Joseph, you're a dead man." But perhaps Pharaoh smiles, but here's what he said. Here's what happened. Pharaoh and his officials approved Joseph's plan. And here's what Pharaoh said to his advisors. "We will never find a better man than Joseph, a man who has God's Spirit in him." Notice verse 41 here. "So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to proud to introduce to you the next prime minister of Egypt. His name is Joseph. And with Joseph and his new title and his responsibility, you know what Joseph did? Joseph did what he always did. He did his best. But the story doesn't end here. We know that famine does come after 7 years of plenty, but Joseph was ready. He had spent those 7 years storing all the grain he could. But the other surrounding countries, even though Egypt was prepared for the famine, the other surrounding countries weren't, and they began to flood into Egypt to beg to buy grain from the Egyptians. Guess who came down to buy grain? Joseph's brothers. Joseph was now probably in his early 40s. It had been probably 25 plus years since they had seen Joseph. They long since he was dead and gone. Joseph now dressed like an Egyptian, looked like an Egyptian, talked like an Egyptian. I bet he even walked like an Egyptian as well. They had no idea who they were dealing with. It was their long-lost brother. As the story goes on, eventually Joseph reveals himself to his brother. He was Joseph, their long-lost brother they thought that they had done away with. What do you think the brothers did when they realized who Joseph was? My guess is they probably wet in their pants. Now, the Bible doesn't say that, but the Bible does say this. They begged for mercy. Look at this fill in the blank. What do you do? What do you do when you've got the power and your decisions determine your enemy's destiny? It depends on the story you want to tell or the story you want to be told by others. In Genesis 50:20, here's what happens. Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me by what you did to me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what's now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph refused, fill in for you. Joseph refused to react, and in refusing to react, he avoided becoming like the people he didn't like. He was free now to write a better story, and he decided revenge would not be part of his story. In addition to rescuing the country of Egypt, he also rescued his own family, brought his family down to Egypt where they settled in with him. Now, folks, this is a story worth telling. This is a story to be proud of. But look at this next fill-in. If your story hasn't been a good one up to this point in your life, it hasn't been a story you would be proud to tell, I want you to remember this. This is just your current chapter. It's just that. It's a chapter in your life. It is not your whole story. Here's the challenge. You and I have to decide. We have to decide to write a story that we'll be proud to tell. And remember, how do we write that story? One decision at a time. Let's write a good one. We saw last week the integrity question. Am I being honest with myself, really? And I ask you to make a decision. The integrity decision is this: I will not lie to myself, even if the truth makes me feel bad about myself. Today we come to the legacy question. The legacy question is simply this: what story do I want to tell? Here's the decision I'm asking you to make today. I will decide a story that I'm proud to tell. I will not decide anything that makes me a liar for life. If you look at the bottom of your outline, here's some things I'm asking you to consider, some next steps, if you would. The first one we just covered. I'm asking you, first of all, will you make that legacy decision? Decide on a story that you'll be proud to tell, and I will not decide anything that will make me a liar for life. And then to keep the conversation going, either in your life group or with some other friends or your family, would you ask these three questions? Here's the first one. Number one, can you identify a decision in the past that served as the beginning of a new, better chapter in the story of your life? What about a decision that introduced a chapter you'd rather regret, or rather you would rather forget? Here's the second question. What was the catalyst for those decisions? And the third question is this: do you know anyone whose story, through no fault of their own, set them up to write a story characterized by bitterness and resentment, but they decided their story into a healthy direction? Then the last thing I would just encourage you to do, we have probably one of the biggest events in our church's calendar each year. It's our fall festival. We're able to do it live this year. It's going to be on Saturday, October 23rd. In order to make this successful and a great event for our church family, but especially for our community, there'll be close probably to 1,000 people here. We've got to have your help. If you're willing to help, if you can just contact our church office, any of our staff members said, I'm willing to help. We need your help, and we'd love you to be part of that special event coming up. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you. Thank you for inviting us into your story. Would you give us the eyes to see, give us ears to hear, and God, would you give us the courage to pause and to think beyond the immediate to the ultimate when making our decisions. God, give us the eyes to see, the ears to hear what you have for us and for our futures. And God, help us to make the decisions that will write a good story, a story that we'll be proud to tell, and a story that would bring joy to your heart as also. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Hey, I thank you so much for being with us. I hope you'll join us next week as we continue our story, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. Next week we look at the conscience question.